The memory stayed with them forever. Decades later, aging men would close their eyes and see it clearly. Blackboards covered in chalk equations, fellow prisoners debating philosophy under watchtowers, the impossible sight of hope flowering behind barbed wire. But this transformation didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't begin where anyone expected. The story of Germany's strangest universities starts not with books or classrooms. It starts with confusion. Pure, overwhelming confusion. When Allied victory became inevitable in 1945, something remarkable was already underway. Thousands of German prisoners were walking free with more than just memories. They carried notebooks filled with formulas, certificates of completion tucked in their pockets, skills learned in the most unlikely place imaginable. These men returned to a shattered Germany as more than former soldiers. They came back as teachers, engineers, lawyers, doctors. The camp schools had given them something unexpected: a future. The impact spread like ripples through post-war society. Former prisoners became professors in universities. Others opened businesses using skills learned behind wire. Some entered politics, bringing democratic ideals they'd discovered in captivity. American and British officials watched with fascination. Reports poured in describing successful reintegration. These former enemies were rebuilding Germany with knowledge gained from their captors. The experiment had worked beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Universities that donated textbooks received thank-you letters years later. Former POWs wrote emotional accounts of gratitude. The barbed wire universities had changed lives permanently. In West Germany's new educational system, former prisoners quietly took leadership roles. They brought appreciation for open debate and structured learning. Their influence helped democratize a nation's intellectual recovery. The fingerprints of those camp classrooms touched an entire generation. But how did such an impossible thing begin? The answer lies not in grand strategy or careful planning. It began with a simple announcement that caught everyone off guard. Morning roll call in Camp Concordia, Kansas, October 1943. The camp commander stepped forward with an interpreter. Behind him stood stacks of books and makeshift desks. The message was brief but stunning. Classes would begin next week. Any prisoner could attend. The reaction was immediate chaos. Some men laughed out loud. Others whispered nervously about Allied propaganda. A few stared in disbelief at the promised classroom supplies. "University lessons for defeated soldiers?" one Wehrmacht corporal muttered. "What kind of trick is this?" But curiosity stirred alongside suspicion. After months of endless routine, the prospect offered something different. Mental stimulation instead of boredom. Purpose instead of waste. The announcement wasn't accidental. Allied authorities had debated this approach for months. By late 1943, American camps alone held hundreds of thousands of German prisoners. Idle men caused problems. Restless soldiers clung to Nazi ideology. Education could serve multiple purposes. It kept prisoners occupied. It exposed them to ideas beyond National Socialist doctrine. Most importantly, it might reshape attitudes toward democracy and freedom. Organizations like the YMCA supported the initiative enthusiastically. They provided books and suggested curricula resembling civilian study rather than military indoctrination. The goal was subtle transformation, not forced conversion. Details of the program astonished the prisoners. Mathematics, history, engineering, literature, foreign languages, advanced subjects that rivaled real universities. Some camps even offered philosophy and art classes. One Heidelberg University dropout stared at the course list in amazement. "They told us we could continue where we stopped," he later recalled. It sounded like cruel mockery. Suspicion ran deep among the prisoners. Underground Nazi groups warned that attendance meant betrayal. They threatened violence against potential students. Loyalty to the fatherland was at stake. But pragmatic voices argued differently. War had destroyed homes, careers, families. Learning during captivity might salvage something from wasted years. As boredom stretched into despair, classroom lectures became increasingly tempting. Practical incentives sweetened the offer. Educational participants received better work assignments. They gained access to additional reading materials. Guards treated them with more respect. German officers enrolled first, hoping their example would encourage followers. In some camps, waiting lists filled immediately. Others saw slower, more cautious sign-ups. What struck prisoners most deeply was their captors' constructive intent. They'd expected hostility or vengeance. Instead, they received invitations to become students again. For men torn from universities and apprenticeships, the offer awakened dormant ambitions. It was the first time I felt I might have a future beyond the war, one Luftwaffe cadet remembered. The announcement created a clear division. Suspicious prisoners clung to resentment and fear. Curious ones embraced hope and possibility. Both groups lived under identical conditions, but their paths would soon diverge dramatically. Now came the truly remarkable part: transforming prison barracks into actual classrooms. Rows of bunks disappeared, pushed against walls, tables arranged in lecture hall formation. Blackboards appeared, some donated, others improvised from painted wood. Chalk and notebooks materialized in quantities that seemed miraculous. German POWs, accustomed to barracks as sleeping quarters, suddenly walked into academic spaces. Rooms echoed with discussion instead of snoring. The atmosphere shifted from military dormitory to civilian school. Camp libraries played crucial roles in this conversion. Donations poured in from American universities, churches, civic groups, dictionaries, history volumes, technical manuals, literature in German and English. Some camps boasted holdings exceeding 10,000 books. The reading material opened windows to broader worlds. Many prisoners encountered perspectives forbidden under Reich censorship. The very act of arranging classrooms carried symbolic weight. Allied administrators demonstrated that education could flourish anywhere. Prisoners themselves built furniture from scrap wood. They painted room numbers on doors, created schedules, hung subject posters. The atmosphere began resembling small colleges more than military prisons. One American camp commander noted his surprise. The prisoners' dedication to creating schools amazed our guards. We assumed they'd remain indifferent. Discipline inside these new classrooms was remarkably serious. POWs arrived punctually carrying notebooks. They greeted instructors with formal respect. For many, this marked their first return to structured intellectual life since war disrupted their studies. The seriousness revealed both hunger for knowledge and desire for dignity. Education became a way to reassert control over lives otherwise dictated by orders and captivity. Space limitations created challenges. 2 or 3 classes often shared single barracks. Thin partitions or time slots provided separation. Lessons competed with daily camp noise. Cooking clatter, exercise yard shouts, guard boots on gravel. Despite obstacles, commitment remained strong. Students leaned in to hear lectures. They scribbled notes by dim lantern light. Assignments sparked discussions long after class hours ended. Detailed chalkboard diagrams became camp signatures. Former engineers drew elaborate technical illustrations. Machinery schematics, maps, architectural sketches transformed plain walls into teaching tools. Visitors stepping into barracks might see equations scrolled across blackboards, Gothic cathedral diagrams, language exercises in English and French. The visual transformation was stunning. Within weeks, schedules filled completely. Classrooms bustled with activity. Prisoners reorganized their entire daily lives around lectures and assignments. Barbed wire remained, guard towers still loomed, but a parallel reality had formed. Inside the barracks, captivity's rhythm gave way to study's rhythm. Men who once carried rifles now carried textbooks. Walls that echoed with despair now resonated with recitations, debates, pen scratching. Among the most remarkable discoveries was the teaching talent within the wire itself. German prisoners weren't just conscripts or farmers. Many possessed advanced education and professional expertise. University professors, secondary school teachers, lawyers, engineers, musicians, all wearing identical uniforms, lost in the anonymity of captivity. The class announcements suddenly made them invaluable. Instead of fading into prisoner obscurity, these men stepped forward as leaders. Their knowledge transformed camps into strange academic communities. Some names became legendary among the prisoner population. A Munich philosophy lecturer offered evening seminars on Kant and Nietzsche. Dozens of curious listeners crammed into converted huts. A former architect sketched building plans on makeshift chalkboards. Ex-medical students organized anatomy lessons using diagrams copied from memory. One prisoner, formerly a Latin teacher, offered daily grammar courses. They became so popular that Allied officers sometimes dropped in out of curiosity. For many POWs, this was their first encounter with such specialized instruction. Not all had been university students before the war. Organization of teaching efforts was surprisingly formal. Prisoner committees arranged schedules, selected instructors, even issued certificates of participation. While these certificates carried no official outside weight, within camps, they became achievement marks. Men who'd been combat comrades now sat respectfully before fellow prisoners turned teachers. Authority shifted from military rank to intellectual ability, a profound reversal of their known hierarchy. Highly educated individuals shaped the diversity of offered subjects. A Hamburg chemist led sessions on chemical reactions. An economist explained unfamiliar market principles. A musicologist organized classical music history lectures, accompanied by makeshift performances on YMCA-provided instruments. These sessions blurred lines between strict education and cultural enrichment. Prisoners gained participation in something larger than mere survival. Teacher-student dynamics weren't always smooth. Some men resented instruction from fellow prisoners, especially if teachers belonged to higher civilian social classes. Tensions flared when political differences emerged. Professors known for liberal or anti-Nazi leanings faced hostility from die-hard National Socialist prisoners. Accusations of betraying the fatherland flew regularly. Despite conflicts, classes endured. Sheer thirst for knowledge often outweighed ideological quarrels. Allied camp administrators recognized these initiatives' value. They quietly supported them by allowing educated POWs access to additional supplies. They requested book donations tailored to specific subjects. Sometimes they provided extra paper for exams and assignments. This indirect support fostered miniature academic societies that began thriving under captivity's constant shadow. For prisoners themselves, wounded instructors carried psychological impact beyond textbooks. They reminded men that their identity wasn't solely that of defeated soldiers. They were also students, professionals, thinkers, creators. Camps became places where hidden talents re-emerged. Men who'd dug trenches could now discuss legal theory. Intellectual pursuits gave dignity to lives otherwise reduced to roster numbers. This perspective shift proved vital as educational experiments expanded. Curiosity transformed into structured, respected pursuit within the barbed wire world. Once teachers and classrooms were established, the curriculum's heart emerged. What astonished German prisoners was the sheer breadth of available subjects. These weren't limited to elementary literacy or basic arithmetic. Courses mirrored real university structures. Mathematics lessons covered geometry, algebra, even advanced calculus. History classes examined not only Germany's past, but also American democracy, British constitutional law, world events that Nazi press had long suppressed. For the first time, many soldiers encountered alternative narratives about war causes, colonial history, democratic institution development. Languages became especially popular. English courses filled quickly with soldiers eager to master their captor's tongue. Some enrolled in French, Spanish, or Russian lessons. Foreign language ability seemed valuable for uncertain post-war futures. Some camps introduced economics, business practices, agricultural science. Practical subjects designed to prepare men for civilian reintegration. Engineering and technical training remained in high demand. Many POWs had once been mechanics or industrial apprentices. With diagrams, textbooks, occasional donated equipment, these lessons simulated vocational schools training men for real professions. Philosophy and literature occupied special curriculum places. Classes on Goethe, Schiller, Thomas Mann gave prisoners opportunities to reconnect with cultural heritage outside Nazi interpretation. Debates flourished with men arguing passionately about freedom, morality, responsibility meanings. Art and music found their way into schedules too. Watercolor workshops, drawing lessons, small ensembles performing Bach or Beethoven in evenings. These activities blurred education therapy lines, providing cultural lifelines in imprisonment monotony. Curriculum structure showed remarkable formality. Syllabi existed. Assigned readings, scheduled examinations. Some American camps collaborated with local universities, providing college-level course outlines. This cooperation ensured academically sound rather than improvised material. Red Cross and YMCA supplied textbooks on law, agriculture, science. German language dictionaries and grammar books allowed students to follow along more easily. Reports described prisoners carrying notebooks filled with formulas, essays, translations, as if they were ordinary students rather than wartime captives. For those forced to abandon studies when conscripted into Wehrmacht, curriculum offered continuity. Medical students captured in Italy could resume anatomy lessons. Law students taken prisoner in Normandy could continue exploring Roman law and international statutes. Others discovered entirely new fields, branching into philosophy or political theory for the first time. The sense that time and captivity could become something useful gradually replaced despair over wasted years. This wide-ranging curriculum also exposed men to perspectives challenging their previous worldviews. Learning about American constitutional principles or French Revolution forced many to question authoritarian structures they'd grown up under. For Allies, this was precisely the point. Education not only kept prisoners busy, but encouraged them to imagine futures different from what the Reich had promised. While some resisted such influence, others found themselves quietly transformed. Their minds reshaped by discussions that would have been unthinkable back home under Nazi censorship. The curriculum became camp school's centerpiece. Ambitious, structured, astonishingly diverse. Reflecting both Allied strategic goals and prisoners' hunger for intellectual life. In these improvised universities behind fences and guard towers, knowledge became both survival tool and change seed. Camp curriculum success depended heavily on access to books and learning materials. Here, outside organizations played decisive roles. International Committee of the Red Cross, YMCA, various church groups across United States and Britain mobilized to supply prisoners with reading matter on unprecedented scales. Shipments of German-language volumes arrived in crates. Classical literature, technical manuals, agricultural handbooks, dictionaries. Some camps' available titles rivaled small colleges back home. One Texas camp boasted nearly 15,000 books. Others in Midwest cataloged holdings with such precision they maintained functioning card index library systems. These libraries created almost obsessive reading cultures. Men who'd rarely opened books before war now lined up to borrow volumes. Captivity restrictions and lack of distractions meant reading became one of few available escapes. Borrowed books circulated quickly through barracks, passed hand to hand until they fell apart from use. Some prisoners kept meticulous notes, copying passages into notebooks. They feared they wouldn't see books again once repatriated. Value placed on well-worn Goethe copies or technical engineering texts was extraordinary. Some volumes were treated like treasures. Allies saw book distribution as more than goodwill gestures, strategic decisions to counter boredom, maintain order, encourage intellectual growth that might soften Nazi ideology. But for prisoners, libraries took on meaning far beyond strategy. They became quiet refugee places where men could lose themselves in novels, philosophy, science. Some spoke of camp libraries as the only places they felt freedom sense. Imagination allowed travel far beyond fences. Material diversity surprised many POWs. Alongside German classics were translations of American authors like Mark Twain and Walt Whitman, French literature, even Russian novels. Scientific texts covered modern advances in chemistry, physics, biology, giving technically minded men chances to keep pace with developments they might otherwise have missed. Religious texts were plentiful, allowing Bible study groups and theological discussions that added another camp life dimension. Physical library arrangements often mirrored civilian institutions. Books organized by subject. Shelves constructed from camp-scavenged wood. Prisoner librarians maintained order with seriousness. Some camps issued library cards stamped with dates and signatures, mimicking outside world. Borrowing and returning books reinforced normalcy sense, reminding men that intellectual discipline could exist even in captivity. Libraries and classrooms worked hand in hand. Mathematics teachers assigned readings from donated textbooks. Language instructors encouraged students to consult dictionaries or literature for practice. Libraries extended camp curriculum reach, giving students tools for independent study. Beyond formal lessons, they fostered self-improvement cultures where men selected books speaking to personal interests. Former farmhands borrowed agricultural treatises. Young musicians explored composition history. Library significance endured long after war. Many former POWs later recalled their first captivity book as turning points, awakenings of curiosity in places where despair could easily dominate. Quiet spaces between shelves, scratching pens taking notes, whispered debates over passages, all made libraries far more than paper repositories. They were camp school's lifeblood, proof that even in confinement, knowledge pursuit couldn't be extinguished. By the time libraries flourished and courses settled into routine, daily academic life inside camps had begun resembling genuine universities. Mornings often started with roll call and basic camp duties. Once chores were complete, men dispersed to assigned classes. Schedules pinned on bulletin boards. Mathematics at 9. Literature at 11. Language lessons in afternoons. Bells or shouted announcements sometimes marked transitions, just as they might in schools back home. For prisoners, this regular study rhythm brought structure to days that otherwise blurred together in monotony. Attendance was voluntary, but participation grew steadily. Some camps reported upwards of 60% of prisoners engaged in some study form. Whether formal classes or independent reading, the sight of men walking across camp compounds carrying notebooks under arms became familiar to guards. Groups formed under trees in warm weather, with improvised tutorials taking place in open air. When winter made barracks cold and drafty, prisoners wrapped themselves in blankets while listening to lectures by candlelight. Determination to continue learning despite discomfort revealed how deeply the initiative had taken root. Examinations were introduced. Though they carried no official recognition at first, they were treated with seriousness. Papers were written, assignments graded. Students took pride in passing tests. In some cases, American and British universities agreed to acknowledge completed coursework after war, giving programs tangible value. University of Kansas and several British institutions cooperated by sending syllabi, exam models, advice. Academic standards inside barbed wire mirrored those outside. For many prisoners, this meant captivity could be turned into opportunity, rather than dead end. Debates became another hallmark of camp intellectual life. Organized discussion societies flourished, where men argued about politics, economics, philosophy. Topics ranged from Bismarck's legacy to First World War causes and democracy's nature. These debates could become heated, with Nazi loyalists clashing against those more open to alternative perspectives. Yet even when tempers flared, the very act of exchanging ideas fostered dialogue cultures largely absent in Third Reich's rigid authoritarian atmosphere. Academic life rhythms also overlapped with artistic expression. Theater troupes staged plays, often German classics adaptations, or Shakespeare performed in translation. Music ensembles held recitals, sometimes in conjunction with history or theory lectures. These events drew large audiences, turning education into entertainment and vice versa. Lines between cultural enrichment and academic study blurred until camps felt like small but vibrant intellectual communities. There was, however, an undercurrent of challenge. Some prisoners saw these activities as distractions from war and defeat's grim reality. They argued lectures and debates couldn't erase barbed wire or the fact their homeland lay in ruins. But for others, daily academic life was a survival mechanism. To sit in classrooms, focus on solving equations or translating literature passages, was to reclaim humanity in environments designed to strip it away. Camp administrators noticed positive effects. Reports noted that prisoners involved in education were less likely to cause trouble, more cooperative in work details, generally healthier in spirit. For allies, this confirmed academic routine was more than luxury. It was a practical tool for maintaining order. For prisoners, it was something deeper, a chance to live with purpose, even in captivity. Chalk dust on their hands, notebooks filled with scribbled formulas and essays. These became symbols of resilience against despair. As camp schools expanded, not every prisoner welcomed them with enthusiasm. Beneath surfaces of orderly lessons and bustling libraries, tensions simmered. A significant number of POWs remained loyal to Nazi regime. They viewed educational initiatives with deep suspicion. To them, these classes were nothing less than Allied attempts to reprogram German soldiers, to weaken their loyalty. In some camps, Underground groups of hardline National Socialists tried to discourage attendance. They warned that anyone joining lectures on politics or democracy would be branded traitor once repatriated. Threats were whispered in barracks. Intimidation occasionally turned into physical violence. This divide often created two distinct subcultures inside Wire. On one side stood eager students, hungry to learn and prepare for post-war life. On other side were resistant factions spending time enforcing ideological discipline, raising Nazi flags in secret, holding clandestine meetings. For camp authorities, these tensions posed real challenges. Education had been meant to reduce unrest. Now it risked stirring conflict between opposing prisoner factions. Guards sometimes had to intervene when fights broke out over whether class participation was honorable or dishonorable. Allied organizers recognized the importance of allowing debate rather than suppressing it outright. They permitted degrees of ideological discussion within classes, reasoning that open dialogue was preferable to secret plotting. Result was that classrooms occasionally turned into idea battlegrounds. Political history lectures might devolve into shouting matches between men defending authoritarianism and those exploring democratic principles. Yet even these clashes served purposes. They forced prisoners to confront worldview contradictions, something that would never have been tolerated under Nazi rule. Suspicion extended beyond politics. Some prisoners wondered whether Allies were tracking attendance lists to identify who might be sympathetic to democracy. Others feared participation in classes would make them appear weak or disloyal if they ever returned to Germany. Constant tension existed between curiosity and fear. Some men snuck into classes quietly, sitting at the back, leaving before discussions ended. These small caution acts reflected how precarious camp society could be, even amid apparent intellectual revival. Despite skepticism, there were also defiance gestures that turned into unintended opportunities. In one camp, a group of committed Nazis attempted to organize their own counter-lectures, teaching prisoners about German military history and nationalist philosophy. Camp authorities allowed these gatherings to a point, knowing that exposure to contrasting viewpoints often encouraged debate rather than rigid conformity. In time, some students drifted from Nazi-led sessions to broader camp curricula, where they found greater variety and intellectual stimulation. Mistrust climate wasn't confined to prisoners alone. Some guards worried that giving German soldiers access to books and education might make them too comfortable, softening captivity's reality. Reports circulated questioning whether it was wise to spoil prisoners who had fought so fiercely against Allied troops. Yet results spoke for themselves: reduced violence, fewer escape attempts, higher morale. These generally silenced such criticisms. Education proved more effective at maintaining order than harsher discipline would have been. These tensions underscored camp life's fragile balance. Every classroom discussion, every borrowed book, carried weight far beyond its subject matter. To study in camps was not simply intellectual choice. It was also political act, one that could attract suspicion from fellow prisoners and even scrutiny from one's own conscience. Yet in long run, willingness of so many to continue, despite risks, showed how strong the desire for knowledge had become. Behind barbed wire, education was never neutral. It was struggle between past loyalties and future possibilities. Over time, classes began producing effects reaching far beyond daily camp life routine. Men who'd once entered captivity, hardened and bitter, started displaying unexpected transformations. For some, the very act of studying rekindled ambitions they'd buried when war disrupted their lives. A young infantryman who'd left behind half-finished engineering apprenticeship now pored over machinery diagrams. Dreaming of futures where he might design instead of destroy, a captured law student separated from Berlin University resumed studies under fellow prisoners' guidance. He imagined returning home to work in reconstruction rather than ideology. Exposure to unfamiliar subjects often broadened worldviews. Soldiers who'd known only Nazi propaganda's rigid certainties found themselves debating ethics, governance, responsibility questions. Philosophy seminars on Kant's works sparked discussions about duty and morality, contrasting sharply with authoritarian values they'd been taught. Language classes introduced them not just to English grammar, but also to idioms, literature, cultural expressions that made enemies feel less alien. This shift, subtle at first, grew as more men realized education could prepare them for different roles in post-war Germany. Artistic and cultural pursuits deepened these changes. A prisoner who'd once been factory worker discovered love for sketching in art classes, producing drawings, capturing both captivity's bleakness and renewal's hope. Musicians, given donated instruments, formed ensembles combining study with performance. These activities reminded prisoners of their humanity, showing them that identity could be reclaimed not through ideology or military rank, but through creativity and personal growth. Psychological impact was equally profound. Imprisonment's monotony often led to despair, but study offered purpose sense. Prisoners spoke of waking with anticipation for classes, of feeling pride when they mastered difficult texts or solved challenging equations. For many, this was first taste of agency after years of orders and conformity. It wasn't just knowledge they gained, but confidence, belief that they could shape their futures once war ended. Such changes weren't without consequences. Some former Nazis began distancing themselves from earlier convictions, quietly admitting doubts during private conversations. Others, previously indifferent, became deeply engaged in intellectual life, seeing in it chances to rebuild themselves. Transformation was uneven and never universal. Plenty of men resisted or remained untouched, but education's presence undeniably altered captivity's atmosphere. Allied observers noticed this shift and reported on it with interest. Psychological evaluations noted that many POWs engaging in study showed greater adaptability and optimism about futures. Camp officials described it as civilizing effect, though reality was more complex. It was less about civilization and more about rediscovery. These men were reclaiming parts of themselves lost to war and ideology, preparing consciously or unconsciously for reintegration into worlds that had moved on without them. In some camps, graduation ceremonies were held where certificates were handed out before fellow prisoners. Though unofficial, these small events carried symbolic weight. Men stood tall as their names were called, proud not of military victories, but of academic effort. For those moments, barbed wire seemed to fade, replaced by illusion that they were once again part of normal society. That transformation sense of becoming more than prisoner numbers marked one of camp school's most enduring legacies. But the real test was yet to come. What would happen when these men finally returned to the world outside the wire? To understand how these remarkable transformations were possible, we must return to the beginning, to that first moment when German soldiers encountered something completely unexpected. The first shock for many captured German soldiers came not on battlefields, but after arrival at Allied prisoner-of-war camps. They'd been prepared by Nazi propaganda to expect brutal treatment, starvation, even execution at enemy hands. Instead, when they stepped off trucks or trains and passed through barbed wire gates, they were met with conditions that defied every warning they'd been told. Guards were stern, but not cruel. Rations were adequate. In many camps, the Geneva Convention was visibly respected. The realization that their captors didn't intend to humiliate or destroy them unsettled many men who'd believed only in extremes. It wasn't paradise, but it was order, food, safety. Things that felt almost unreal after months of war. For young Wehrmacht soldiers barely out of school, this sudden transition was bewildering. They'd marched through ruined cities in France, Soviet Union, later through Germany itself, carrying only destruction's weight behind them. Now, in American or British custody, they encountered neatly organized barracks, latrines that functioned, regular meals. It was a different world, one that resembled discipline but lacked cruelty. At first, their conversations filled with disbelief. They wondered how long such treatment would last, if it was simply facade before harsh realities set in. Yet as days turned into weeks, many began noticing something even more unexpected. Opportunities for education and personal growth that no one could have predicted in war's middle. These early impressions mattered greatly. Allied strategy wasn't accidental. American and British authorities recognized that treating POWs in line with international law could undermine Nazi propaganda and potentially reshape prisoners' attitudes. Some guards even went further, offering respect that prisoners hadn't anticipated. When officers addressed German captives as gentlemen or allowed them to correspond with families, psychological shock was enormous. For many POWs, this was first crack in ideological wall that Third Reich had built around them. If their enemies weren't the barbarians they'd been warned about, then what else might be untrue? Atmosphere of these first months also laid groundwork for intellectual awakening that would follow. Without battle orders, without marches or campaigns, prisoners had time. More time than they knew what to do with. Some tried to pass days with endless card games, carving wood, writing letters, but soon rumors began circulating that captors were preparing something unusual. Flyers were pinned on notice boards. Announcements were made through interpreters. Classes would be offered inside camps. At first, it sounded absurd. University-like lessons for defeated soldiers? Most assumed it was trick. Yet signs of change were already visible even before official start of these programs. In some barracks, educated men had begun gathering small groups, teaching each other from memory or with whatever paper scraps they could find. Former school teacher might explain mathematics. Law student might outline basic legal theory principles. These spontaneous efforts revealed hunger for mental activity. Allies recognized this and quietly encouraged it, seeing chance to turn captivity into something more productive. But prisoners themselves, still fresh from surrender's shock, remained uncertain. They hadn't yet realized how far these opportunities would go, or how much they would transform culture behind wire. First chapter of this story, then, is not about classrooms or lectures, but about disbelief. German soldiers captured in North Africa, Italy, or Normandy stepped into camps expecting misery, only to discover that their captors would feed them, clothe them, and, most astonishingly, give them chances to learn. Before books and blackboards appeared, there was simple astonishment of survival, dignity, and unexpected path forward. That sense of contradiction between what they'd been told to expect and what they now lived became soil in which camp education seeds would grow. The transformation was complete. What had begun with confusion and suspicion had blossomed into something extraordinary. Behind barbed wire, in the most unlikely circumstances imaginable, hope had taken root. Knowledge had flourished. Lives had been forever changed. The barbed wire universities had proven that even in humanity's darkest moments, the desire to learn, to grow, to become better could never be truly extinguished. And that legacy would endure long after the last camp gate swung open.